1697. Sweden is one of the truly great powers of Europe, with an unstoppable army and an empire that nearly encircles the Baltic. But as the church bells toll, the world knows the king is dead and his 14-year-old son is inheritor to the crown. The vultures begin to circle. The danger of empire is that the more you have that other people want, and the Swedish Empire was no exception. In this case, the lands of the Swedish Empire had drawn the attention of someone brilliant, dynamic, ruthless, and ambitious. The 25-year-old Peter the Great. Peter had a love of the West. He was drawn to all things European. He saw the future of Russia not to the south or the east, but chasing the setting sun. He saw that future in becoming part of the great European economic system. But there was one obstacle to this grand design. He needed a port in the Baltic. He needed a way his ships could sail west bearing Russian goods or projecting the might of Russian arms. But the Baltic ports that Russia had once held had all been gobbled up by the Swedish Empire. Now it was time to take them back. But Peter wasn't alone. The king of the Danes had long chafed under the idea that traditionally Danish land in southern Sweden had been taken from them by the Swedish Empire, and he longed to get it back. And Augustus, the king of Poland-Lithuania, found an intriguing prospect within the Swedish borders as well. You see, the Polish-Lithuanian king was an elected title without much power, but he wanted to become a hereditary monarch, ruling over Poland-Lithuania as many of the other monarchs of Europe ruled over their domain. Right on his border, just inside the Swedish territory, was the small province of Livonia. The nobles there offered to declare him their hereditary king if he would liberate them from the Swedish. This intrigued him. If he could get them to declare him king and then integrate them with Poland-Lithuania, it would go a long way toward achieving his larger goal of making a real kingship out of the Polish-Lithuanian crown. Soon, these three forces became secret allies against the Swedish. Things dragged on for a while as Peter continued to pretend to be a friend of Sweden, hoping to avoid a war with them until his current war with the Ottomans could be wrapped up. But at last, in 1700, his allies moved ahead, striking at the Swedes without warning, though in a piecemeal and ill-coordinated fashion. 14,000 Polish-Lithuanian troops marched across the border of Livonia first and laid siege to the capital. But the Swedes counterattacked. The Polish-Lithuanian troops were shattered. Their general lay dead. Soon, they were in full retreat back to the border. Then the Danes made their move, a move to which Charles XII, the boy king of Sweden, responded with unexpected vigor. With the energy of youth, Charles raised money from every quarter, bolstering the finances of the overextended Swedish Empire and launching a force that he himself would lead. After daring naval maneuvers and a surprise landing, the stunned Danish forces capitulated and left the alliance against the Swedes entirely. Meanwhile, Peter still stood by. It was the perfect time to press the Swedes, and he knew it, but still no word of peace had come from the Ottomans. At last, when the peace was signed with the Ottomans in the hottest days of summer, it was finally Peter's turn to act. And act he did. To support the now reeling Polish-Lithuanian forces, he raised a massive army and marched toward Livonia. His objective was Narva, a major town right on the Russian border. But in this age, with the mud and roads of Russia, an army of that size moved pretty slowly. It was November before they reached Narva. In the biting cold, they dug trenches into the frozen ground and prepared for a siege. But their guns did little, and their assaults were swept aside. So a real siege it became, to starve the town out. But once Charles XII had thrashed the Danes, he had wasted no time packing up his little army and moving it east to deal with the invasion of Livonia. Braving autumn storms on the Baltic, he personally led his forces toward the true test of their strength. Many of his counselors argued against this endeavor. After all, even if he got to Livonia, he'd have to march his troops 150 miles across wasted ground in the middle of winter. And if he actually reached Narva, he would be outnumbered at least 4-1. More than that, the Russians he planned to assault were dug in with siege works, defenses they'd been preparing for weeks. But the now 18-year-old Charles was not put off. He was spoiling for a fight. So with the same boundless energy he applied to everything, he launched his winter campaign. And thus it was that on the 30th of November, the young king assembled his 10,000 men against at least 40,000 Russians. They calmly began to prepare for an assault. The Russians watched this in disbelief. Peter, who was used to a much slower pace of warfare, thought that it was impossible that anyone could attack immediately after completing a march like Charles just had. So he had left the night before to attend business in Russia, leaving in command a subordinate who, in line with Peter's policy of bringing in foreign experts, was a foreigner who barely spoke Russian. The rain began to pour, and yet the Swedish army calmly continued to ready for an assault. The sky darkened. A storm rolled in, the snow was pouring in sheets, sleet slashing at the troops. The blizzard blinded both sides. Fighting was impossible. Men stood shivering in regimental formation, weapons at the ready for a battle that wasn't gonna come. Charles's advisors suggested that he call off the assault. But then the roaring wind began to turn, and Charles's keen eyes saw it. During this brief window, the enemy would be entirely blinded by the snow. He ordered the advance. 2 columns hidden by a sea of white fell upon the Russian lines, which quickly began to break, shots flying high in the snow. Soon it was down to bayonet and saber in the Russian trenches. Most of the Russian troops were ill-trained levies and began to scatter before the Swedish veterans. The Swedes had pierced the enemy line, and the Russian troops began to melt away. Soon it was a complete rout. Panicked Russian soldiers chased by ragged and wraith-like Swedes, appearing like ghosts from out of the snow. The men stampeded over one of the only bridges across the Narva River. Under the weight of so many panicked souls, it collapsed. Timber and stone and Russian bodies tumbling into the water below. Thousands of Russians were trapped. It was an impossible victory, a crushing blow. But now Charles had another objective. The King of Poland-Lithuania had yet to personally suffer at his hand, and Charles was not a man to let what he considered to be a perfidious treachery go unpunished. So, though Peter greatly feared a Swedish advance into Russia, and began immediately patching together a second force for defense of the motherland, Charles did not pursue Peter's deeply wounded army. Instead, he wintered in Livonia, and prepared to bring the fight to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth the following year. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe had tumbled into the chaos of the War of the Spanish Succession. So preoccupied they were with the events in the West that they were no longer engaged enough in the events of the East to serve as arbiters or brokers for peace. In fact, diplomats and ministers wrote to Charles to tell him that he had a singular opportunity. He could tip the scales of Europe. If he would make a victorious peace with the powers he had just crushed, he could determine the outcome of the Spanish War and decide who would inherit the vast lands of the Spanish crown. Play it right, and he could ensure another 100 years of preeminence for the Swedish people. But he never responded to any of these letters. He had his sights set on only one thing: war. So join us next time as we explore the character of the 2 great antagonists of this conflict, Peter and Charles, and cover the invasion of Poland-Lithuania, the second phase of the Great Northern War. With the Russians and the Danes effectively out of the war, Charles planned to descend with the full force of his victorious army upon the one enemy that remained to him, Augustus, King of Poland-Lithuania. Now, you would think that the situation would be looking pretty grim for Poland-Lithuania. They've just finished getting kicked around, they're basically out of money and resources, they're politically fractured, and their allies have essentially all dropped out of the war. Most people would back out now, find a diplomatic solution, see if they could cut their losses. But Augustus had a new plan: just keep losing. He made a few half-hearted attempts at peace, figuring that if he didn't really put a lot of effort into it, he could get right on to losing some more. So when Charles XII basically ignored his call for peace, Augustus gathered his generals and said to them, "Guys, we really absolutely cannot let the Swedes cross the Dwina River, or hoo boy are we gonna lose a lot. Wink wink nudge nudge." And with that, his commanders set out to meet what supporting troops the Russians could give them, which surprisingly was actually more men than they were fielding themselves. Proceeding with the plan, the main Polish-Lithuanian commander managed to deceive himself into thinking that the Swedes were going to land miles from where they were, and went personally with the best of his troops to defend a place where really nobody was going, all while leaving 2 non-military men basically in charge of the real army. Unaware of this, and so undaunted by Augustus's fearsome plan, Charles XII landed where everybody knew he was going to land all along, except for this master of self-deception. Yet still, despite all of this, the odds for the Polish-Lithuanian forces seemed pretty good. They outnumbered Charles 3-1, and they were dug in, while Charles would have to manage an amphibious landing and assault their entrenched positions. As dawn just barely broke through the darkness, the Swedes filled boats with damp straw and set them alight, sending them sailing towards the shore, great plumes of smoke obscuring their approach. The Polish-Lithuanian cannonades fired, and the clever floating counter-batteries of the Swedes sang. Under this bombardment, the troops approached, and in the first vessel against all entireties sat the Swedish king Charles XII. He landed with his grenadiers. The Polish-Lithuanian troops fell upon him, planning to push him back into the waves, but they faced the best of the Swedish regiments, led personally by their king. The Swedes did not falter. The Polish-Lithuanian troops fell back, and the Russians fled in a screaming panic, many having never fired a shot. At last, though, the Polish-Lithuanian commander returned with all the troops he had taken with him, and the Polish-Lithuanian forces assailed the Swedes again. But Swedish reinforcements had now landed, and they were now much greater in number. Again, the Poles and the Lithuanians were beaten back, and then a third time, at which point the Polish-Lithuanians were basically like, you know what, screw this, let's go home. Which was a pretty good thing for Charles, because having come from ravaged Livonia, he basically started this whole campaign with no supplies whatsoever. He did manage to capture plenty after the battle, though, and was now well on his way to being ready for a good long fight. Augustus, realizing now that the Swedes were clearly not caving before his plan to just keep losing, went back to the drawing board. Now he had an even better plan. Now he would just keep losing even more. And so, while Charles wintered in Wergen, throwing snowballs at his officers and breaking their windows so that they didn't fall too much in love with comfort, Augustus prepared for his next near miss. This time, he was to get himself trounced in a swamp. It was a near-run thing for a while. For a moment, it looked like the Polish-Lithuanian forces might accidentally prevail. Augustus was in a good position, surrounded by woods and boggy terrain. He outnumbered the Swedish forces 2-1, and there was just no way the Swedes were going to drag their cannon through that morass. It was touch and go for a bit, hard fighting for the Swedish forces, who were, as usual, exhausted from Charles's relentless marches. So then Augustus, nice fellow that he was, managed to let the Swedes take over his camp and turn his own artillery on his troops while they tried to retreat through a marsh. Yet still, Charles was not cowed by Augustus's mighty strategy of just keep losing forever. And so Augustus refined his plans even further. He realized now that this approach had been too complex thus far, too multifaceted. He would now simplify it, put it in layman's terms. His new plan was losing. Keep doing it. So Charles rode up to the gates of Krakow and shouted, "Open the door!" And when the guards peeked out to see who this shouting man was, Charles personally forced the gate and held it, while 300 of his men, who, not quite prepared for this, charged through anyway. And so it was that Charles took the great Polish city of Krakow with a handful of men armed only with unloaded muskets and canes. You've got to hand it to Augustus. That was some solid losing. But even this did not make Charles quit in disgust. And so, after being deposed by Charles XII, who elevated another king in his place, Augustus spent some time thinking. Pondering for a while and furrowing his brow, he at last came to one resplendent, crystal-clear idea. He had thought the one sentence that he needed to think, and that sentence was, "Cool, now seems like a good time for a civil war." So Augustus raised his banner against the new king. But the civil war began slowly. Augustus assembled his forces in the Duchy of Saxony, while the Russians ravaged Sweden's Baltic provinces, which really had little to do with Poland-Lithuania, but, good times. Meanwhile, Charles laid siege to the ancient fortress of Thorn, where he won surprising praise from the Polish people, as when the city fell, he treated it with remarkable gentleness, letting captured men return to their families, even driving a herd of cattle and a flock of sheep into the city so that the starving defenders could eat. But once things got going, the whole war teetered back and forth, with Augustus recapturing Warsaw while Charles was out trying to compel parts of Poland-Lithuania to support his puppet king, and then Charles swooping back in to retake the capital while Augustus beat a retreat. But by 1705, the dominoes began to fall. The Great Poland-Lithuanian Plan was to crush the Swedes between the hammer of Augustus's forces marching from the west and the Great Russian Anvil to the east. But Augustus's forces ran into a tiny Swedish contingent outside of Warsaw, 1,900 cavalry and just 60 infantry. The Polish-Lithuanian commander, with his 10,000 men, was certain of victory. His forces rushed against this small band of Swedes, but somehow, by sheer grit, the Swedish cavalry, despite being outflanked or almost encircled by the overwhelming number of the enemy, threw back their attackers. And then, at the last minute, the 60 infantrymen emerged from the tall rye grass where they'd been hiding, the surprise turning the Polish-Lithuanian effort to regroup into a rout. Predictably, something similar happened to the Russians in the east, and soon the iron was beating up both the hammer and the anvil. And for the sake of brevity, this just keeps happening all over, both in open battle and in sieges. The Polish-Lithuanian forces and the Russian forces just keep getting crushed. But Augustus made one more push for Warsaw. Here again he was intercepted by a force half his size, but this time superior in cavalry. His commander tried to hide which of his troops were Russian by having them turn their uniforms inside out, but even this clever ruse did no good. The Swedish commander realized which part of the line was made up of Russian conscripts and assaulted it with all of his force, swinging his cavalry in from the rear and the side. Meanwhile, the rest of the army was rendered useless by assaults on both flanks, the Swedish commander copying a page from Hannibal's book and managing to envelop the enemy forces with his smaller army, much as Hannibal did at Kenny. Soon, the army was in full retreat. But with their superior cavalry, the Swedes were able to cut them off, and the retreat became an unconditional surrender. No longer able to field an army, Augustus was forced to sign a humiliating peace, giving up his kingship, abandoning his alliance with Russia, and acknowledging Charles's puppet king of Poland-Lithuania. But Augustus is not done yet. Eventually, he would stumble upon a novel, new, and arguably better idea: winning. So join us next time as the two greatest figures of this period, Charles XII and Peter the Great, square off in a battle for the destiny of Eastern Europe. Two houses, both alike in dignity, in fair northern Europe. Wait a minute. With Poland-Lithuania out of the fight, Charles XII sets his eyes on another foe, the Russian giant Peter the Great. While Charles had run roughshod over Poland, Peter had taken advantage of the moment to once again assail the Baltic provinces. He was stopped short of his ultimate goal, but Peter's efforts there were not without gain. His armies carved a path all the way to the Swedish fortress of Nyenskans, which he tore down to build an even greater fortress, the Peter and Paul Fortress, which would serve as the cornerstone for his most ambitious project of all, St. Petersburg. He would erect a new city here, one grander and more modern than anything Russia had ever seen. This would be his gateway to the West, his port that tied Russia into the economic life of Europe. It would be his new capital, on which he would spare no expense, in treasure or lives. This was to be the culmination of his legacy, the embodiment of all his ideas on westernizing Russia, on becoming a naval power, on embracing European art and science and culture. But for that to be the case, Russia would have to succeed in holding on to these gains, something that Charles XII could not abide. Throughout 1704 and 1705, Swedish forces tried to take Peter's great fortress, but time and again they were repelled. Soon costs started to mount, and men that could ill afford to be lost died for little gain. So Charles revamped his strategy and blockaded St. Petersburg. While the blockade dragged on, he began marshalling his main force for a march to the east. It was at this point that Russia sent him a peace offer. In return for an armistice, Russia would give up all of their gains, except for St. Petersburg and the forts connecting it to Russian territory. But Charles was having none of it. He knew how important St. Petersburg was. Why, with his invincible army, should he give it up? So Charles marched east, braving horrible weather and dangerous crossings to move with his traditional lightning speed. As he pressed forward, Peter fell back and back. Each defensive line Peter's commanders had planned to entrench was taken before their men could even unpack their spades. But even this march could not make up for the time Charles had lost trying to make Poland support his puppet king. In the years that had followed his initial victories over the Russians and the Polish-Lithuanian forces, Russia had not only seized and fortified what would become St. Petersburg, but reinforced it, and kept reinforcing it. Yet, the Swedish army was strong. Their king was able, their officers daring and intelligent. Top members of the military thought that it would be a tough fight, but that they could take St. Petersburg. They drew up plans and submitted them to the king, who swore them to utmost secrecy about the plans they had concocted. And so the officers marched, thinking their objective to be St. Petersburg. But soon they found themselves near Minsk. Wait a minute, that wasn't on the way to St. Petersburg. Charles had marched them in a different direction, and there was only one place they could be going from there. He was marching them to Moscow. Charles's officers had told him that they were not ready, that striking so deep into Russia was simply too great of a gamble. It was something the army simply wasn't prepared for. But how many times before had Charles been told that something was too great a gamble? How often had he heard that something was impossible, only to then achieve it himself? He had made up his mind. They would not waste their time retaking lost territories. He would unseat Peter himself. The first two rivers they crossed with little opposition, being slowed only by the fact that the retreating Russian forces burnt every bridge along the way. Tartar horsemen also harassed them continually, but this seemed a minor nuisance. They were making good time through bad country. But then, at the Wabis River, they found a large enemy force barring their passage. The position held by the Russians was daunting. The Swedes would have to traverse marshy ground to get to them, and beyond that was a forest which might hide yet more troops. But Charles saw a way. The enemy line had a gap in it along a swampy area that the Russians clearly thought was impassable. Charles personally led his army across 1,500 yards of killing ground to reach this swampy area. At one point, his men were shoulder deep in water. The enemy line was split. The Russians tried to use numbers to heal the breach, but heroic actions from the Swedish cavalry prevented any joining of Russian arms. Soon the line began to collapse. The crossing was theirs. Once again, the Swedes had triumphed against impossible odds. But keen observers in the army would have noted that though the Swedes emerged victorious, these Russian troops were made of sterner stuff than they had been 8 years back. Tactics and firm soldiering had been hammered into them since their retreat at Narva. They would not be turning and running like that anymore. This victory left Charles's army exhausted. It would take a month of rest before he could really move them again. And during this month, Peter was not idle. Peter stripped the land bare. He laid waste to any stretch of ground that the Swedes would have to cross, and even though it was his own country, and the suffering caused to his own people was immense, Peter made no half measure of it. Every grain of wheat was carted off. Every pasture where a horse might graze was turned to ash. There would be nothing but wasteland for the Swedes to traverse. Thus began a time of suffering for the Swedish forces. When they resumed their march, food was scarce, and with scarce food came disease. This victorious army began to march as defeated men, with hollow eyes and weary steps. Charles continued to rally them, but he had no real answer to this predicament. He had been counting on living off the countryside as they marched. Their supply lines were stretched beyond their limit. Many asked him to turn home, but he believed in Swedish arms. He believed that if he could just force Peter into one decisive battle, they might yet win this war. But Peter demurred. He would not give Charles the battle he wanted. And so the Swedes marched across fields of ash, seeing always in the distance villages alight, candles in remembrance to Peter's uncompromising policy of starvation. In frustration, Charles turned to his officers and asked their advice. They recommended that the army fall back to the Dnieper and meet up with a relief force laden with supplies. But this would be tantamount to giving up the campaign, so Charles asked for other options. Reluctantly, it was suggested that the Ukraine had not been as thoroughly plundered. It might be possible to gather supplies there and enlist the aid of friendly Cossacks. But such a move would cut the army off from any real ability to communicate with Swedish territory, or get resupply from the Empire. Still, Charles saw it as a possible path to victory where retreat offered none. His officers pleaded with him to at least wait for the relief force and their provisions, but Charles, fearing that further delays would only give Peter more time, turned the army toward Ukraine immediately. They would now retrace their steps until they could turn south, walking back across the same blasted waste from which they had just come. But as summer gave way to autumn and autumn to winter, a chill set in. Then a deep cold. Then a freezing, bone-gnawing frost. And not just any frost. This was what is known today as the Great Frost, the coldest winter Europe has experienced in 500 years. Rivers froze from the Thames all the way down to the lagoons of Venice. And this frost served Peter well. By the time the winter of 1708 and 1709 came to an end, Charles had only 20,000 remaining men able to fight, less than half the number he'd begun this campaign with. Half of his undefeated army lost. But there's still hope yet. Join us next time to find out what happens to his reinforcements, to the Cossacks Charles hopes yet to enlist, and most of all, to the great army of Charles himself, as he and Peter finally square off at the Battle of Poltava. Snow and fatigue had narrowed all the possibilities of this war down to one stark inevitability. Peter and Charles would meet on the field of battle to decide the fate of the Baltic world. Charles had brought his forces into the Ukraine. He hoped his army would be able to live off the land. More than that, though, he hoped for two great reinforcements. First, he hoped to meet with the supply train that he had opted not to meet up with on the retreat from the Moscow campaign. And second, he hoped to engage Ukrainian Cossacks to serve as his allies. But now Peter himself was on the field. As the supply column that had been supposed to provide relief to Charles XII turned south to meet with the main army, Peter intercepted it. The initial fighting was fierce. Again, the Swedish army was half the size of the Russian force, but despite this, for a moment, it looked as though they might shatter the Russian forces anyway. This time, though, Peter was with his army, and with him, the hardened elite Russian guard, who stood firm and anchored the wavering line. The fighting turned into a brutal slog. By nightfall, neither side had made any conclusive blow. Both sides withdrew with the setting sun, the Russians to the nearby woods, and the Swedes to their defensive position. The Russians settled in to rest, but the Swedes stayed in battle formation, fearing another attack. As the night drew on, though, it became clear that no new attack was coming. So, rather than fight against rested and reinforced Russian troops with his exhausted army, the Swedish commander ordered a withdrawal under the cover of dark. But as they crossed the muddy ground behind them, the wagons and the artillery began to get stuck, slowing them down. Abandoning some of their artillery and baggage, they managed to make it to the nearest town, but the bridge they needed to truly make their escape had been burnt by a Russian detachment. Seeing this, the men began to panic. But the Swedish commander made the tough choice. They would unload the wagons, carry what supplies they could, and burn the rest. Unfortunately, in these wagons was, amongst other things, the army's alcohol rations, weeks' worth of it. Such a waste. So as the men began to unpack, many of them also took the opportunity to consume the liquor that they would be throwing away. Soon, the army was drunk. Men got lost in the woods. Others had to be left behind. The orderly Swedish retreat dissolved into a chaotic flight. What few men were still good for fighting were given mounts, and these few thousand troops made their escape. No supplies from this caravan would ever find their way to Charles and the Ukraine. Charles's other hope for succor was a man named Ivan Stevanovich Mazepa. Ivan had grown up the bastard son of a minor Polish noble, but as a young page in the Polish court, he had been caught in flagrante with a married nobleman's wife. He had been promptly tarred and feathered, then tied to a horse. With Ivan's face firmly tied to the horse's rear, the horse had been sent packing, running off unguided into the wild. Everyone had expected that Ivan would die on the Ukrainian steppe, but Cossacks had found him, untied him, and gave him a home in their tribe. Valorous and ambitious, he had risen within their ranks until, when he was 48, the tribe had unanimously elected him to lead them. For years, he had ably served Peter the Great, but secretly he had always hoped to be free of Peter, to create an independent kingdom for his Cossacks. When Charles had begun rampaging through Poland, Ivan began to negotiate with him. After all, this Swedish king might have a real shot at overthrowing the Russians. Charles never took these overtures too seriously, though, at least not until desperate circumstances forced him to. As his campaign to Moscow began to fall apart, he reconsidered the value of this Cossack hetman. He agreed that, in exchange for the 30,000 horsemen that Ivan said he had under his command, the Swedes would offer their protection to the Cossacks. It was with the intent to meet up with this force that Charles turned southward. It was for this Cossack force that he abandoned the inebriated and ill-fated resupply train that was originally meant to catch up with him. Charles needed these troops, and the sooner he could link up with them, the better. But Ivan Mazepa had severely overestimated the Cossacks' loyalty to him. When he made his rebellion known, it was 3,000 Cossacks, not 30,000, that decided to follow him. The rest maintained their allegiance to Peter. Peter then burnt Ivan's capital and sent the bodies of Cossacks tied to crosses floating down the Dnieper to discourage further rebellions. By the time Ivan struggled into Charles's camp, he had merely 1,500 men with him, and few supplies. Now cut off in the Ukraine, the situation for the Swedish army was desperate. They were using saltpeter instead of salt to preserve food. They didn't even have enough wine to give the sacrament to dying men. So Charles made a bold plan. He would attack the fortress of Poltava and gain a secure location for his men to rest and await supplies from the rest of his empire. But the privations of the winter had taken an even greater toll on his army. Almost all of his artillery had been left behind. They had almost no shot, and the powder had gotten so damp and waterlogged that men complained that when they fired they could see the balls drop to the ground 30 feet away. They had also lost much of their officer corps, and now that it was summer, gangrene was spreading through the camp. But still, they put Poltava to siege. Each day they tried to mine underneath the fort and use sappers to drop its walls, but without artillery the going was slow. All the while, Peter raced toward Poltava with a massive relief army. And then, Charles's legendary luck finally ran out. While overseeing the siege works, a stray bullet caught him in the heel, passing straight through his foot and embedding itself near his big toe. That day, he rode and worked through the pain until his men noticed that he was ghastly pale. When they took him to his tent and cut off his boot, they found that his foot was a wreck. He would have to be carried on a litter for at least the remains of the campaign. Then Peter reached Poltava. His massive army of 80,000 dwarfed the 18,000-ish men of Charles's army that were actually in fighting shape. This giant force arrayed itself in front of the fort and began to dig in. Still, Charles and his commanders chose to rely upon the expedient they had always relied upon: assault. At first, things go well. Swedes overrun the forward batteries and the assault sweeps forward. But then things begin to bog down. Inopportune orders are given. The Russian line is given time to firm up. Between the men left behind to guard the camp and those ordered to maintain the siege, even while the main fight is going on, the Swedish army is down to about 4,000 men. The order is given. They are to rush the entrenched Russian line. Cannon fire rips through the line of charging men. Bullets rain down upon them. By the time they reach the Russian works, nearly half of them lay bleeding on the field. The king orders his litter raced to the front to encourage his men. One by one, his litter bearers are shot dead around him, until only 3 of the original 24 remain. The king's litter drops, smashed upon the ground. What few men are left surge forward, trying to prevent the Russians from capturing their king. A major rides up, dismounts, and lifts the king onto his own horse, only to be torn to pieces by Cossack sabers moments later. The king is whisked to safety, but at what cost? The army is routed, stumbling back across the steppe, disorganized. They need to cross the Dnieper to escape, but the Russians are fast on their heels. The Swedes are forced to make a difficult decision. The king is sent ahead with 1,500 of the fastest combat-ready cavalry they have left. The remainder of the army is transferred to one of the king's generals. 2 days later, with the Russians closing the army's line of retreat, 14,000 of what had once been the world's finest army surrender en masse. Can the king escape? Can the Swedes recover? Join us next week to find out. Ragged and battered, the tattered remnants of the Swedish army fly south. Charles hopes to find succor within the Ottoman Empire, but Peter is hard on his heels. Nearly starving, suffering from the heat, the remaining Swedes raced south until they arrived at the very border of the Black Sea. But as the local prince haggled over prices for boats to ferry them into the Ottoman Empire, Peter overtook the Swedish rearguard. 800 were lost, only 500 remained. But those 500 made their way into the Sultanate. There they were treated regally, given food and drink, even allowed to set up an almost autonomous colony which the Ottomans helped them to build. But Peter did not relent. As his forces approached the border of the empire, he demanded that Charles be handed over. The Sultan, who was no friend of the Russians, refused, so Peter decided to force the issue. He would bring war to the Ottoman Empire itself. His army, augmented by forces from Moldavia, plunged towards Plough River, where they were rapidly cut off by the giant home army of the Ottoman Empire. For a moment, it looked as though Peter and his entire force might fall into the Sultan's hands. But where Peter and his subordinates had clearly lost the war, you might argue that they won the peace. Deftly using diplomacy to extricate his army, Peter was allowed to leave the Ottoman territory with his army intact for little more than an agreement to give Charles safe passage back to Sweden, and a handful of very minor territorial concessions. But this was not good enough for Charles. He pushed the Sultan to make war on the Russians. The Sultan had no interest in such a costly project. He was basically like, "We won you the right to go home, man. Just go home." Charles then decided to be the ultimate bad house guest and declared, "All right, I live here now." To which the Sultan replied, "Dude, come on." And Charles responded, "I will cut you." At which point the Sultan, in his infinite patience, said, "Look, I will give you 10,000 pounds if you will just leave." Charles took this payment, and then, like any bad house guest, said, "All right, I will leave if you give me 8,000 more." At which point the Sultan was like, "Okay, time to call the sheriff," before remembering, "Oh wait, I'm the sheriff," and then promptly surrounded Charles's small force and threw him into jail. After cooling his heels for a while, Charles was, at last, allowed to return to Sweden. And it was at this point that good old Augustus the Strong, deposed King of Poland, returns to the spotlight. After having a good long think, he had finally decided, I have heard good things about winning. New plan? Let's try that. He was super excited about this plan, and, why wouldn't he be? It's a pretty solid plan. Anyway, he proceeded to basically roll Swedish forces back to the very borders of Polish-Lithuanian territory. Then, after a heroic last effort from the Swedish troops, he bottled them up in a fortress in Holstein-Gottorp, and, when no aid came to save them, he forced them to surrender. The last truly major army of the Swedes had vanished. So the dominoes began to fall. Russia, Norway, and Poland-Lithuania were already at war with Sweden. Those who had fallen out of the alliance due to previous defeats were now back in. Then the King of England got into the mix, under his other title as Elector of Hanover. And then so did Prussia. So at this point, Sweden is basically at war with all of Northern Europe. Their resources are tapped, and the great armies that had swept them to empire were now shattered or imprisoned. But Charles was not deterred. Never one to surrender, never one to make peace. He raised what forces he could and kicked off a campaign in Norway. And this began pretty well. He cut his way through the thin Danish-Norwegian defenses, threatening to overwhelm the knife at the back of Sweden. But then disaster struck in the Baltic. Norwegian naval forces ambushed the Swedish fleet, nearly wiping it out. This left Charles unable to resupply, and he was forced to retreat once again. Meanwhile, in Finland, which was part of Sweden at the time, the Russians had invaded. Initially, the going was slow. The Russians were impeded by poor roads and bad weather, but Peter, with his love of ships, settled on a new course of action. One where the Russian offensive would be centered on the coastline, where men and material could rapidly be transferred by sea. The Swedish commander in Finland was continually on the retreat, having neither the men nor the supplies necessary to contest the Russians. For this, he was recalled and replaced with a man who was much more likely to agree to the native Finns' demand for a fight. And fight they did, twice, but long gone were the days when Swedish forces could beat the Russians 8-1, or even 2-1. The Swedish army in Finland was almost entirely made up of Finnish troops, not the Swedish corps who had done so much at the outset of the war, only to be eventually wiped out in Russia. This Finnish army was beaten back both times. This all occurred just before the Swedish Navy got stomped outside of Norway, and I'm sorry for how confusing these timelines are, but at this point everything is kind of happening at once. The Swedish fleet was sent to help out the Finnish forces, to take some of the pressure off. But Peter, great lover of sailing ships that he was, ironically used a fleet of galleys to blaze past them on a day in which the sea was calm. Soon, the Finnish front was untenable, and what troops were left were recalled to defend Sweden itself. But Charles was not yet done. He planned a return to Norway. He knew there was exactly one hope. He needed to capture the fortress of Fredriksten, the very same place he had just lost his fleet failing to capture. He raised another 22,000 men for his last attempt to turn things around. Their campaign in Norway was hard going, always in want of rations, having to swim across rivers or climb whole mountains to achieve the positioning that Charles wanted. But despite this suffering, Swedish discipline won out. And through this privation, the army never truly wavered, because they had always the example of their king, who always took the roughest tasks for himself. By November 1718, they made it to the fortress. Charles himself led an assault on the outerworks and overwhelmed them with his loyal grenadiers. Things were progressing nicely, but now the fortress had to be breached. On the 30th of November, Charles went to inspect the trench works. Laughing and joking with the men, he encouraged them in their work. Then, as night fell, the defenders put burning wreaths on the fortress wall to illuminate the surrounding ground. The king suspected that they might sortie out and try to smash the progress that had been made on the siege works before returning to the safety of their fort, so he climbed to the lip of the trench to get a better look. A nearby French officer, who had just joined the Swedes, called out to him, "That is no fit place for your majesty. Musket balls and cannonballs have as little respect for the king as for the common soldier." The king simply responded, "Don't be afraid." And one of the Swedish officers told the Frenchman, "Let him be. The more you warn him, the more he'll expose himself." The moon now washed the whole battlefield in a pale light. Soldiers worked, officers directed, and then there was a soft, wet sound, no louder than that of a rock gently dropped into a pool. The king was dead. A shot had passed through his left temple and out the right. He died where he lay, right at the top of the trench works. The succession passed to his sister, but the spirit of the army was gone. A retreat was made, and preparations to defend the homeland began. But defense was only a dream. From 1719 to 1721, Sweden suffered brutal raids and incursions from the Russians, until, at last, they were forced to make peace. Sweden had to cede almost all of its territory except for the home country itself and Finland, which, after an occupation known as the Great Wrath, the Russians agreed to leave be. The grand dream of Charles was smashed, and with it, the Swedish Empire. Sweden would never rise again to such a position of prominence on the world stage. But as Charles's dream lay in ruins, Peter's became a reality. Russia pushed westward, gaining ports along the Baltic coast. More importantly, they proved that they were a power on the rise, that no longer could calculations about European politics be made without factoring the Russians in. Thus, the Great Northern War ends, and the wheel turns as one empire falls and another rises.